Hello, everyone. I think we'll get started now. Greetings from sunny Kampala, Uganda. Thank you so much for joining lecture 6 out of 9 lectures on this virtual PhD course on urban economics in developing countries. As those returning will know, this course is co-hosted by the Bureau for Research and Economic Analysis of Development, BREAD, and the International Growth Center. Really great to have you all back again to learn more about this very exciting field of economics research. My name is Juliana Oliveira Cunha. I'm a policy economist at the IGC Cities That Work initiative, and I'll be chairing today's lecture, which will be focusing on the very important topic of prime and state capacity, making and breaking the city. So to teach us something about this, we're very privileged to be joined today by two incredible scholars. So with us today is Professor Augustin Bergeron, who's an assistant professor of economics at Harvard University. And we're also very fortunate to be joined by Professor Joana Monteiro, who's a fellow Brazilian like myself, which makes me super excited. Joana is a professor at FGV-EBAP, the Brazilian School of Public and Business Administration, and the director of the Center for Applied Research to Public Security at the same university. So thank you very much, Augustin and Joana, for joining us today. As in previous weeks, a few housekeeping items, which I'm sure you're all aware at this point. But maybe first and foremost, as some of you have may noticed from today, so for the next few lectures, we'll be starting at a different time, maybe that they have before, and that's because UK British summertime has come to an end, so clocks have changed on our side. So please do check whether this has affected you. But then on the lecture, this will be 1 hour delivered by Augustin and Joana, and it will be followed by the typical 20 to 30-minute Q&A in the end. So as before, if anyone would like to act as a live participant during this lecture, meaning that you have access to mic and video, you can interact verbally during the Q&A. Please virtually raise your hands, and Greg, our technical assistant, will randomly select a few of you to join the discussion. But for other participants, please type any questions you may have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. You can submit questions at any point during the discussion, and it would be great if you could include your name and affiliation when you write your questions as well. And as you know, you can upload a question if you're very interested by clicking in the thumbs up icon. I'd like to note that we are recording all lectures in this series, and these recordings will be made available on IGC's website, along with the slides and reading lists from the lectures. And then finally, just a reminder for those who attend at least 7 lectures in this series, you'll be issued with certificates of completion. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Augustin to lead off with the lecture. Thank you.
Thanks, Juliana, for the introduction. Let me share my slides. Okay, so we're going to talk in the next 30 minutes about the first component of this 2 lectures and talk about making the city. And in particular, we'll put emphasis on how we can make a city and building, in particular, on building local fiscal capacity in low-income countries. And so to motivate a bit what we're going to talk about today, I want to start by a few illustrations that are going to show you some evidence that public goods, service, and social assistance program looks very different across the world today, and then we'll try to understand why that's the case and how it's connected to fiscal capacity. So we're going to start with, it's a class on urban development, so maybe let's start with highways. This is how a highway look like in the suburb of Austin in the US. So we see a very complex system of highway, lots of vehicles on the road at any point in time, lots of capacity for transportation in this setting. However, this is not how highway look like in other parts of the world. This is now showing you what highway number 1 look like in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where I conduct a lot of my work. This is actually formerly a highway. It connects Kinshasa to all the way to the east of the country, connecting Kananga, where I conduct work, but also the Kivus, the extreme east of the country. And so, of course, you can see stark differences between those 2 highways. This highway here is not asphalted. The road is in dire condition, made of sand. And of course, it's way less large. There's less vehicle being able to go at any point in time. And so as a result, you can see that most people walk along this highway, or the most courageous one push a bike or drive a motorbike on the sandy road. Additionally, when it rains, things look even worse. When the rainy season hits, you see motorbikes stuck in the mud or cars stuck in the mud and being pushed and pulled by many people. And so stark differences here, but that's not the only kind of domain where public goods look different. We can now also look at medical facilities. So this is an operating room in the US with kind of up-to-date or super modern equipment for surgeries, etc. If we were to look at what an operating room looks like in the DR Congo, things look quite different. This is an operating room in Kananga, in the middle of the country. You can see medical equipment is less, up to date. There's no access to running water, and electricity is intermittent. So you might have power outages while conducting complex surgery, which is not fantastic. And connecting to, what we're going to talk about in the second part of this lecture, what Joanna is going to talk about, crime and violence, we also see difference in policing in high-income and low-income countries. Here's the example of traffic enforcement in the US. You see a policeman using a radar to kind of identify, drivers that are committing infractions, stopping them and sanctioning them. How does that look like in the DR Congo? Well, quite different. Policemen can take bribes from drivers who are not respecting a kind of traffic enforcement. So that's an image here of a bribe being paid to a policeman. But they can also act as in an extortionary manner by trying to get a bribe even for people who are respecting the legislation, for example, by entering their vehicle. So that's a very dramatic example, or just standing on the windshield until the person pays a bribe, even if they're complying with the legislation. And this has consequence for traffic. If you look at an intersection in Kinshasa, those are two very big intersections in this context. As you can see, they're much more chaotic than would be expected or needed. And that's part of the reason is because of the behavior of police and traffic enforcers in this context. Maybe one last example that will, on kind of public goods and services, and connecting to the second part of the lecture is on conflict resolution. So how does it look like in the US? Well, it's a formal system, and so you have, if you can bring your case to court, you'll have juries that will decide on the outcome. You'll have lawyers, and you'll have a judge. That's kind of how justice operates in the US. How does it look like in the DR Congo? Well, quite different. Okay, there are people who are able to access a formal legal system, but most people will actually have access to informal conflict resolution. They will talk to their customary chief. That's one of them here, symbolized by the stick, and the hats are what symbolize that he's the customary chief. And what you can see is the two parties pleading their case to the chief, and the chief will adjudicate for one or the other. We'll discuss about the compensation and the modality of sanction. So public goods or services look different across the world. We take two examples here, but that's not the only thing in terms of what governments operate. They not only provide public goods or service, they also provide social assistance programs. So think about programs that are trying to shield poorest households from being in vulnerable condition. In the US, you'll have access to formal social assistance programs. So for example, you can apply for unemployment benefit if you lose your job. In the DR Congo, they're a program, but they're much smaller in scope and they're way less formal. Okay, so here's two examples of programs that take place every year in the DR Congo. On the left is an anti-poverty program where people receive an eligibility ticket for a cash transfer that are deemed targeted for poor household. And then one person, one person is picking the winners from a box. So it's a randomized cash grant for some of the poor households. So there's not enough capacity to provide relief to every single individual. They have to kind of take winners from a box because of this low capacity. Okay. On the right is another government program, which is a workfare program, where individuals are paid for a few hours of work repairing road and infrastructure, but it's not a kind of a constant and guaranteed stream of income. They are just compensated for 1 or 2 hours of work on a given week. Okay, so we see across those examples, what I'm trying to portray is a sense that public goods and services, but also social assistance, looks vastly different in high-income countries and low-income countries, both in terms of quantity, but also quality and reliability of those public goods and services and social assistance programs. And so a key question to kind of set up our diagnostic here is, well, why is that the case? And in order to understand why this is the case, we need to look at what is financing those public goods and services, as well as the social assistance programs. And so thinking a bit systematically about source of finances, typically we can separate those as funds coming from tax revenue, funds coming from social contributions, those coming from non-tax revenue, so natural resource, investment income, and borrowing, and the last component are typically grants. And so we can see this in a chart. If you think about the total government revenue that is available, you can separate it in grants. That's the item here, social contribution, non-tax revenue, and then tax revenue. And tax revenue can be further split, and we'll talk about some of that in the lecture, into direct taxes and indirect tax, where direct tax will have tax on individuals and corporation, and indirect tax will be, for example, sale tax or VAT. And so the key question is, out of all those sources of revenue that are plausible for the government to use, well, what are the main ones? Okay, so where is the key problem in financing public goods and services across the world? And according to the data that we have, it seems to be that the bulk of the revenue comes from taxes. Okay, so you should think about 80% or a bit higher than that of revenue that finances public good service and social program coming from taxation. And so this already hints towards the fact that our diagnostic is going to come from tax revenue. Okay, and we're going to try to understand, well, how can we improve tax revenue in parts of the world where they seem to be lagging behind? Okay, so we now need to turn towards understanding, how does tax revenue look across the world today? And this is what this map shows you. It shows tax revenue in percentage of GDP across countries today. Okay, and so the axis here, or the color scheme, is how much tax revenue a country leveraged, normalized by the size of its economy, so its GDP. And what we see as are a few striking patterns is that there's huge amount of variation across the world today. Some countries collect as little as 5% of their GDP in taxes, while others collect more than 40% of their GDP in taxes. And again, we've normalized the number by the size of the economy, by their own GDP. So this does not just reflect that some countries are richer than others. It really does reflect that countries are collecting more taxes as a ratio of their economy than others. Okay? The second key pattern we're going to take away from this graph is going to be that typically what we see is high-income countries collect more taxes and percentage of their GDP. Okay, the darker color here are kind of more present in Europe and North America, for example, as well as big parts of south of Africa here, and some components of Latin America here collect more taxes. And so one way to see this relationship between tax collection and income status is to organize countries by their GDP per capita. That's what is on this figure here. The x-axis is GDP per capita. The y-axis is the share of taxes in GDP. This is just what was on this map here. Okay, so we're just now showing this map, but instead of showing it as a map, we're organizing it by countries' GDP per capita. And to further cement idea, we can categorize countries as low-income country denoted by triangle, middle-income countries by circles, and high-income countries with crosses. And so what do we see from this figure? Well, there seemed to be a positive relationship between a country's GDP per capita and the share of taxes in their GDP. So in other words, how much taxes they're collected normalized by the size of their economy. Okay, so in other words, it seems to be the case that low-income country collect very little taxes, even as a ratio of their GDP relative to middle-income country or high-income countries. Okay, and so overall, what I'm trying to portray in this introduction and diagnostic is really some evidence that part of the problem that we'll have is trying to increase tax compliance and revenue for low-income countries in order to finance public goods and services that are required for economic prosperity. And you might ask at this stage, well, how is that connected to urban development? This is a lecture about urbanization and urban development. Well, what this next slide tries to portray is that this is going to be a tremendous issue for urban development because more the bulk of the issue comes from actually local taxes rather than federal or national taxes. So what this figure shows you is how low-income countries perform relative to high-income countries by different tax instruments. So the corporate income tax on the left, the value-added tax next, the a personal income tax following, and then the property tax last. And you should think of corporate income tax, VAT, and personal income tax as typically federal taxes where all the money goes back to the central state. The property tax tends to be a local tax where the revenue goes back to the local jurisdiction and is financed for local public goods and services. So for example, property tax collected in a given city will typically be spent on that specific city. And what we see from this graph, kind of without giving you too much details, is that governments in low-income countries tend to perform similarly as high-income countries on collection of the CIT, VAT, and PIT. So again, those kind of federal taxes, they're not doing much worse than high-income countries. On property taxation, so on local taxes, things look much different in high-income countries that have a high capacity to collect those taxes versus low-income countries that tend to do really way less, up to 20 times less well than high-income countries, according to this figure. So it seems to be that there's a problem at the local level, and this is going to trickle down into lower local public goods and services, which are important for urban development. So that's going to be our diagnostic. That's concludes our diagnostic. Public goods and services look different across the world today. They're for low-income countries and high-income countries, and part of the issue, at least correlationally, seems to be on the kind of spending side, and in particular on the lower level of tax collection and revenue in low-income countries relative to high-income countries. So we're now going to turn to our research questions and the method that are used to answer this set of questions. So the key big picture question that we're going to talk about in the next 20 minutes or so is, well, why is it the case that low-income countries tax so little then? Okay, if we know that this is going to be important for financing public goods and services, why don't they collect more taxes? What's the issue? We're going to kind of split this question in three subcomponents. We're going to talk about the role of information. Maybe low-income countries lack information about individuals and firms that are needed to tax them. Maybe the problem is about tax rates and enforcement. Maybe tax rates are too low, so they're not ambitious enough in their tax rate, and that leads to a low level of revenue. Maybe they're too high. There's a tax rates that are so high that nobody can afford to pay them, and things are falling apart there. Or maybe states are finding it difficult to enforce the taxes that are in the book, and so we have an enforcement problem. The last component we'll talk about is a more personal economy of the state. Maybe the key issue is the people that are hired to collect taxes. Okay, maybe the state apparatus and the bureaucrats are not, recruited well enough. Maybe they're not well allocated, or maybe they're poorly incentivized. Okay, so we'll talk about that. Of course, a caveat here is I can't talk about all the reason why low-income country tax so little. So there's other components that are very important and very interesting, such as tax morale. Governance being poor typically leads to low level of tax morale and willingness to pay. We're not going to talk about this much, but there'll be some material in the reading list for those of you who want to dig deeper into tax morale as a determinant of low tax capacity in low-income countries. And so on the method side, well, those are interesting questions, but they're very hard to answer. How do we study this question? How can we find the causal effect of each of those topics on tax revenue and tax compliance? And so this has been kind of a booming literature over the past 10, 15 years with kind of two approaches. The first one is to use natural experiments that result from tax change. So think about a government suddenly changing its tax rate or other feature of its tax system. And we can then use those changes that are happening quasi-exogenously combined with administrative data to study the effect of tax rate change or enforcement change on fiscal capacity. There's a vast literature that has used that approach. We'll talk about some of that in the lecture today. However, what we're going to spend most time on is our randomized controlled trials that are designed and conducted in partnership with tax authorities. This is a literature that is a bit more recent, and it's more difficult to operate those randomized controlled trials, so there's a bit less literature, but that's what we're going to spend more time talking about today. And the idea here, you can connect it to a broader literature in development of economics that has tried to emphasize that economists are not, kind of in their ivory tower thinking abstractly. The economists should actually be thought as plumbers that, collaborate with governments to identify and fix leakages in governance. And here, what the leakages that we're going to think about that we want to identify and fix are going to be leakages in their tax system. So now I'll spend like roughly 5 minutes on each of those components, the role of information, the role of tax rates and enforcement, and the role of tax personnel. So, information, I think the key intuition is pretty straightforward. In order to tax individual, you need to have information about the transactions that are happening between those individuals. Okay, so you need information about the taxable transaction that take place in the economy to collect taxes. And one simple way to see this is to look at, read history books. And what you see is that typically governments focus first on the activities that were easier to observe. Okay, so historically, governments focus first on trade taxes because they could observe transactions between individuals before starting taxing income or firms. And the example I like the most is the Danish sound dues that I think make it straightforward. They're toll tax that were collected from ships that passed through a strait in Denmark that connected the Baltic Sea to the North Sea. Okay? And why is that a case for where information is rich? Well, you can observe the ship passing through, right? It's not that they can pass unnoticed. So you have direct information on the ship passing through the strait. You can stop them, you can assess them, and you can tax them. Okay? And in fact, that represented like a huge amount of revenue for the Danish state, about 50% of its budget in the 16th and 17th century. How did it look like in practice? Well, this is an example of the sound. This is an image of the Sound Strait. And as you can see, well, there's ship passing through, and there's kind of authority on both sides of the strait, able to assess what the ship contains and tax them as a result. And it's very hard to pass without kind of being noticed and stopped. Okay. So this is an historical example of why information matters for fiscal capacity. In modern times, it's not that we tax ships and straits only. We actually have more tools to gather information about transactions happening in the economy. And a key source of information is what's called third-party reporting. What is third-party reporting? Is a situation where some agents have an incentive to report information to the government that includes evidence of the tax obligation of other agents. And this is going to create a paper trail that the government can use. This sounds very technical, but it's actually very simple. And maybe the best example you can give is the example of wages. So how do when there's third-party reporting work? Well, what happens is the employer will file wage form with the government. And why do they file wage form of their employee with the government? Well, because they want to deduct wage from their profit tax in order to pay less taxes. And that was going to create a paper trail of employee income that the government can use. So it's not me who report my own income to the government where I would have incentive to misreport. It's my employer who reports my income because they want to deduct my income from their tax. And that's the paper trail. Okay, that's what's happened. And in fact, there's research by Anders Jensen that documents that this was very important in the development of a fiscal capacity over time in the US and across the world today. Okay? And so typically countries that have more tax revenue today tend to have a higher share of employee in their labor force than countries that have lower fiscal capacity today. And so you can see it as an example here. This is a cross-sectional kind of example. You can see that a country like India that has lower fiscal capacity than the US, for example, typically has more people, and a majority of people will be self-employed over employees. That's the blue line here over this red line. In the United States, the majority of people are employees and very few people are self-employed. And so in the paper, what Anders Jensen does is it connects this ratio of employee to self-employed to the emergence of fiscal capacity, showing that this was a crucial component in the emergence of fiscal capacity. So third-party information matters. Another source of third-party information is the VAT, the value-added tax. And so what is the third-party information in the VAT? Well, it is in the VAT chain. So think about firms that have suppliers within a VAT chain. Firm 1 is the supplier of firm 2, which is the supplier of firm 3, and firm 3 sells to customers. Well, for firms within that VAT chain, the client firm have an incentive to ask the supplier for a receipt. Why? Well, it's the same thing as the wage incentive I told you. They want to deduct their input costs from the VAT, right? If I don't have the receipt from my supplier, the government will think I have zero input cost, and so I'll pay more taxes. So I have an incentive to ask firm 2 if I'm firm 3 for receipts, and same firm 2 has an incentive to ask firm 1 for a receipt. However, at the end of that chain, self-enforcement is going to break down because consumers don't have an incentive to ask for a receipt. If I consume a good from a firm, I don't have an incentive to ask them for a receipt. Why? Because I'm not a firm myself. I don't report any costs. And so I don't have an incentive to ask for a receipt. Self-enforcement breaks down. And so Dina Pomerantz at the University of Zurich studies this. She studies the self-enforcement of the VAT in Chile by conducting a randomized controlled trial. It was one of the first randomized controlled trials conducted directly with the tax authority, so highly influential paper. And what she did is she randomized letters informing 100,000 firms in Chile that they had been selected for special scrutiny and might be audited. And what does she find? She finds evidence that confirm the self-enforcement property of the VAT. She finds that there is an increase in reported sales to consumer, but no increase in reported sales for intermediary sales. And so what's happening here is, well, there is no effect when in intermediary sales. Why? Because there was already a VAT paper trail and there was no incentive to misreport. Okay, so that's the figure at the bottom right. However, in case of final sales, sales to consumer, where there was no incentive to ask a receipt, there is a sharp increase following the letters in the reported sales. Why? Because there was no third-party enforcement and no kind of self-enforcement property of the VAT at this last transaction. Okay. And so you might think, well, what can government do when they have limited information and they don't have third-party information? Well, they will typically struggle to collect taxes effectively, but does it mean that they should give up? Well, not really. And there's been some potential solution has been found in the work I've conducted with my co-authors that show that in this context, you can delegate tax collection to informal leaders. Why? Because those informal leaders have local knowledge. So they don't have formal knowledge, they don't have third-party information, but they have local knowledge. That's what we find in a randomized controlled trial. We find that local chiefs, when assigned to collect taxes, can leverage their local knowledge to target high payment propensity households, and that leads to an increase in tax revenue by about 44%. Okay? So that's our first component. Information matters for tax capacity. We'll now move on to explore other tax policy tools available to low-income countries' government. I'll spend roughly 5 minutes on tax rates and enforcement, and maybe a little bit less on tax personnel. And throughout those studies, we'll use a common methodology. We'll now kind of zero in on using results from randomized controlled trials. And in particular, we'll focus on a series of randomized controlled trials that my co-author and I conducted with the provincial governments of Kasai Central in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the goal was really to understand the impact of these policy tools, tax rates and enforcement, and tax personnel. So let's start with tax rates and enforcement. How did we study this question? The key question we're after is, how should governments in low-income countries set their tax rates in the first place? And so to study this question, we worked in the context of a door-to-door property tax campaign that was conducted in the city of Kananga in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's the 4th largest city in the country, so a very important setting. And the randomized control trial we implemented was unique in the sense that we worked on randomly assigning tax liability to property owners. And those liabilities were written on the tax letter that the government issued to them. So you should think of an individual being potentially randomly assigned to either the status quo liability, so the amount of taxes that they should have paid under the status quo system, versus lower amounts, so it's 17% or 33% or 50% reduction. And those were randomly assigned. So in other words, you could receive a tax letter that featured the status quo rate, so that's an example at the bottom left, or a tax letter that featured a higher amount, that's the example at the bottom right. Sorry, a lower amount, that's the example at the bottom right, that's the 50% reduction here. Okay. And so the key question we're asking is, well, what were the effects of those kind of different amounts? And in particular, what happened as the amount increased? And we have 2 quantities of interest. The first one is tax compliance, which is the percentage of owner who paid the tax. But ultimately, tax compliance is not what the government cares about. What they care about is tax revenue. How much revenue do you generate at those different amounts? This is a more complex object. It's a function of the tax amount that you're charging to individuals, but also the number of payers, the number of people who are willing to pay at this certain amount, which is the fraction of owners who paid, so the tax compliance times the number of owners. Okay. And so in the next few slides, we're going to document effects on tax compliance as well as effect on tax revenue at those different tax liabilities imposed by the government. So what do we see? What we find is that, maybe not surprisingly, tax compliance decreased as the tax amount increased. Okay, so this figure shows percentage of taxpayers on the y-axis for different tax amounts, kind of ordered by the value of the amount of tax people had to pay. So the 50% reduction is the lowest amount, followed by 33% and 17% reduction. And then the status quo, there's no reduction. So that's the highest amount that the government charged. What we see is tax compliance was much higher when people received a 50% reduction. 13% of people paid, relative to the status quo, where there was no reduction, where only 5.6% of people paid. Okay. And in fact, this is maybe the most surprising result, is now looking at tax revenue. So that's the tax amount collected per property owner on the y-axis for the same categories. What we see is that tax revenue actually decreased as the tax increased. Okay, we see that tax revenue was higher for individuals who received for groups that received the biggest reduction, the 50% and 33%, than for individuals who received the status quo liability or even a small reduction. So what's going on? Well, again, tax change and tax increase in this context had two effects. There's a revenue effect. If you charge a higher amount, you have to pay more, the taxpayer pay more. But there's a compliance effect. Fewer people are willing to pay at those amounts, there's more tax delinquent. And so what we find in the setting is that tax revenue actually decreased because the compliance effect dominated the revenue effect. Yes, you had more revenue for each taxpayers, but you had way less taxpayers in the first place when you try to increase amounts. Okay. And so one immediate consequence of this is maybe low tax enforcement play a role. Maybe people just refuse to pay when the tax amount increases. And so the immediate next step question we ask in our research is, well, what happens if the government threatens sanction for tax delinquents? And so here we worked on a different randomized control trial with the same tax authority that also randomized message on tax letters. Individuals could receive a control message saying paying the property tax is important, while others received an enforcement message that emphasized sanctions and consequence for tax delinquency. So the key question is, what happens for individuals who receive the enforcement message relative to the individual who received the control message? Well, what happens is people who receive the enforcement message, for those groups, the revenue maximizing tax rate is now higher. Okay, and so why is that the case? The revenue effect has not changed. The amounts that are due are the same. What has happened is the compliance effect has changed. When you threaten enforcement, you have less people dropping out of the tax net as the tax rate increases. And so you're able to charge higher tax rates and get more revenue out of them. Okay. And so in other words, what we find is a kind of, as a conclusion on this tax rates and enforcement, a few slides, that low enforcement can impose a ceiling on the type of tax rates you can afford to charge. When enforcement is low, increasing tax rates can lower tax revenue. However, enforcement threats allow higher revenue at higher rates. So in other words, and that's why I've lumped together tax rates and enforcement are complementary policy. Government should think about them together, and they should increase tax rates jointly with tax enforcement to reap the benefits of higher tax rates. And so the next question that's I'll spend 3 minutes on roughly is, well, what can government then do to increase tax enforcement in low-income countries, given the importance of enforcement in itself, but also jointly with tax rates? There's work showing that increasing the number of audits is helpful. There's also work showing that size matter, number of collectors and auditors is going to be important. What I'm going to focus on is work that works more at a micro level, that's trying to understand, well, do the people you hire and your tax administration matter? So we'll see that the allocation of tax collector is going to matter. How you compensate them is going to matter, and who you hire in the first place is also going to matter. And so we're going to work in the same context of door-to-door property tax campaign in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in the city of Kananga, but we're going to leverage a different randomized control trial that consists in the random assignment of state tax collector to teammates and neighborhoods to identify their optimal assignment. And so those are like the tax collector. Think of them as kind of going door-to-door collecting taxes from individuals. We're in this paper, and I'm going just skipping all the complexity and the technical aspect of it. But what we're trying to identify is what we call the optimal assignment, which is the assignment that maximizes tax compliance while keeping a few things fixed. We're keeping the fixed the workload of the tax collector, but we're also keeping fixed the fact that we're sending 2 collectors to each neighborhood. Okay, we're not distorting collectors' incentive, and we're trying to search for an allocation that does better than the current allocation. And what we find is that positive assortative matching seems to do better than the status quo. What is positive assortative matching? It means you should assign collector with high ability together, and you should assign them to neighborhood with high ability to pay. On the other hand, you should assign collector with low ability, you should match them together and assign them to neighborhood with low ability to pay. And the key question is, what happens if you implement this quote unquote better assignment of workers? What we find is that it would lead to a dramatic effect on tax compliance and revenue. Tax compliance would increase by 47% and tax revenue by 38%. To cement ideas, this is tax compliance under the status quo. About 8% of people pay the property tax. However, under the optimal assignment, you'd get a much higher level of tax compliance. The next 2 margin are that you can compare this solution to is what happens if you just hire better collectors. And so this is what this figure show is on the x-axis is how many, what fraction of your collector are you firing, the low performing collector, and replacing by a new draw from the pool of collectors, and what's the effect on tax compliance, that's the y-axis. And we see that this hiring policy margin matters for tax revenue and tax compliance. You get more tax compliance and revenue if you hire a better tax collector. However, it doesn't match exactly the effect of the optimal assignment. You always do a little bit worse than the optimal assignment. And so hiring matters, but maybe the allocation in itself is a more powerful tool in this context. What about the wage of the tax collector? Maybe the problem is the compensation of those workers. They're not paid enough. This is what this next figure looks at. It looks at the effect of increasing the wage of the tax collector on the x-axis. So 0% is the status quo wage, 100% is a doubling of their wage. And what's the effect on tax compliance? That's the y-axis here. So we see, not surprisingly, if you compensate workers more, they'll do more effort, they'll work more, and they'll collect more taxes. However, if you want to compare it with the optimal assignment I've described to you, we'd have to increase tax wages dramatically by 88% to yield the same increase in tax compliance and revenue. The optimal assignment in the paper, we argue that that actually would lead to negative impact on tax revenue for the government. So in other words, the kind of takeaway from of this section is that tax personnel matters, and the government has access to several tools, but we think the assignment of workers is a very potent tool that government can use to increase tax compliance and revenue, maybe even relative to hiring better workers or incentivize them more. There's been more work that has done by Adnan Khan and co-authors. I'll leave that for those of you who are curious. You can read the slides or read the paper in the bibliography. To stay on time, I'll just conclude by saying that overall, we've seen that building fiscal capacity is extremely important in order to finance public goods and services, as well as social assistance program across the world today. And we've seen that there's many levers that government can use: information, tax rates and enforcement, and tax personnel all matters for building fiscal capacity at the local level. And on a methodological point, there's large scope, I think, for more collaboration between researchers and tax authorities to understand those topics much better. So with not much further ado, I'm passing to the next second component of this lecture to Joanna, talking about crime and violence.
Hello, can I jump in? Let me share my slides. Is it possible to see? Yes?
Yes, we can see it.
So, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So the idea is now I'm going to talk mostly about crime now. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about crime trends and patterns, causes, consequences, and I hope to spend like half of the talk discussing a little bit what we can do about this and what we should be doing and what we can do about to reduce crime and violence in low and developing countries. So First of all, I think it's important to say that when we discuss cities, actually crime is a very important thing that determines how we deal with the city, how we live in the cities, all right? So the fear of crime in cities creates psychological barriers and limit the sense of freedom and how we can experience the city. And for you have an idea how prevalent this is, if you take a survey for Brazil, shows that 60% of the population say that live in state capitals in Brazil, in the 27 state capitals, they say they feel very unsafe or unsafe in the city. And urban crime really shapes how we navigate, experience, and interact in the city. So also the same surveys show, for instance, that over 70% of the population indicates they do not use cell phone in public spaces. They avoid going out of home late. They avoid places with few people, and and over 1/3 say they choose their leisure activities according to depending on how violent and reflecting crime. So we don't, when we think about crime, so the first indicator we have, the first variable we have is homicides. So these are people that are being killed by violence, right? And when we discuss homicide, we basically like it's impossible to do that without talking about homicides in the Americas, which is the continent that concentrates 34% of homicides globally, although it has only 12% of the population. So, and there are many reasons why we expect that the Americas at all, and Latin America in particular, have above average homicide rates. One of them is because of illicit drug trade, in particular drug cocaine. The second one is the proliferation of firearms. And the third one is the proliferation and fragmentation of heavily armed criminal groups. I'm from Brazil and I study mostly Latin America. So most of my talk, we're going to talk about like evidence that we have for Latin America, which is for the United States, which is mostly like where the research on crime and violence comes from. I would like to discuss there more about Africa and Asia, but it seems to me I do not know a lot about how it's going on, what's going on related to urban crime in these areas, but it's something that we don't listen a lot about it. So, but it's necessary some more research for us to understand this. But I want to go deep a little bit about to discuss this problem in Latin America, that what we know there is that we have a lot of homicides there, and a large share of these homicides is caused by group violence. And when we say about these groups, it's not only organized crime, we see organized crime pretty much in every city in the world, but we see like very violent organized crime and these criminal groups that they dispute territories, they dispute criminal markets, and they are heavily armed. We see that in Brazil, in Mexico, in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Central America, and this creates in some cities extremely high crime rates, especially homicide rates. But it's important to say that it's not the presence of the organized criminal groups that matters that translates into high rates of homicides. We do have a lot of criminal groups in Europe, in Asia, and we do not observe the same levels of violence. So one thing that we really need to think deeply, it's why we have this problem is so more acute in Latin America. And we have some guesses about what it is. So actually, crime levels will be influenced a lot, whether you have just one group that dominates all the criminal market or whether you have several, whether you have what they call gentlemen's agreements, whether there are like some pacts and agreements between groups or in between groups and the state authorities. And there is also this expression about like the Pax Mafiosa that comes from Italy, or in the translation to Americas would be the Pax Narcotica, which is when the group itself, the criminal group, organize and deliberately reduce violence in order to reduce police attention and criminal repression. And there is also a fourth point that we have there's emerging research that shows that part of this huge crime levels depends on how the government interact with these groups, in particular how they intervene, and especially if state law enforcement is heavily relied on militarized enforcement, and this many times can increase the problem. So one thing that recently a lot of people has started talking is that although homicide levels is our main indicator of violence and our main indicator of this problem, when we look data across cities, we see huge variations over time in the way that homicide levels behave. And I think we could hardly get time. So this figure, for instance, shows homicide rates in the 5th most populous cities in Brazil. And basically it shows, especially for instance, Fortaleza, which is this green in these graphs, it shows huge variations across years. It's go up and down by 50% each year. And it hardly one would believe that when it goes down, it's because the criminal group is less powerful. So basically we have increasing people like contesting the fact that the using homicides as a proxy of violence or even the presence of the group would be a good measure. So for instance, this correlations is based on 75 cities in Mexico that pretty much correlates homicide rates in the left with whether people report that have seen gangs, and on the right, whether people report they were victims of extortion. These are the average for each city on homicide rates and these variables, and we see we don't have like a very good correlation. So there is increasing concern and effort to think about how we can measure this better. So this is a survey a national household survey in Brazil that shows, for instance, alternatives ways to think about that. So this survey actually, you ask people whether in the last 12 months around their household, there were shootouts or fights involving firearms. In some cities, this number is over 40%. So in Rio de Janeiro and Fortaleza, that are cities highly marked by the presence of several criminal groups, we see that these numbers are super high. I particularly appreciate this question that says whether there is extortion or collection of illegal fees, which is and it shows, for instance, in Rio, it's the highest rate in Brazil, is 12% of people report that around their households, there were extortions. And I think this is the element that I'm going to go back on that later, but that really matches with what Augustin was saying, that it's really the element that the criminal groups like touch the formal state, right? It's when they are really competing with the state about their taxation capacity. And this is a phenomenon that we are increasingly seeing in Latin America, and I think it will grow a lot. So what the literature has been doing in order to understand the presence of organized criminal groups. So there are papers using police intelligence data, which is very hard to get, but some people were able to do that. Most of the literature on crime overall is based on crime registers, but which is typically not very good to measure this problem because people typically do not report extortion. You have a lot of turf wars or shootings that are not necessarily recorded in the police. We have a bunch of papers that use media accounts or Google News in order to track what the groups are present. And we have nowadays more like the cutting edge research on this topic. It's really like putting together different pieces of data set in order to really describe the problem and really like trying to understand the basics of the problem, for then we be able to understand the causes and the consequences of it. But I typically say that this is a problem that we still do not understand well. So this is like a very acute disease that we do not understand much where they are and how they transmit. And I think it's something that is very important to relate that with the conflict literature and the insurgent and rebel group literature, which is like when we are studying civil war and conflict and so on, we are expecting that these conflicts will gonna end. And one group will gonna win over the other, and then we're gonna eliminate the group or the problem. In the case of organized crime, we barely could think, I think our best hope is to control their size and their economic power and reduce the amount of violence they create. But so we pretty much gonna talk about like eliminating criminal groups, but really reducing about that. And if you think about that, it's even more important to have metrics that can capture what they are doing much more than simply saying where they are. So I have done work in Rio de Janeiro, which is basically like using a tip line in order to that people call and report and describe a lot of stuff that is going on related to several security issues, but especially about like criminal groups. And pretty much people report whether they have armored circulation, street blockage, surveillance, violence, threats, and whether criminal groups are involved in different activities. So basically like using automatic text message, we are able like to collect and code these reports and pretty much try to create a panel data that shows over time how these groups have evolved, which would be the basics of the basics to understand, to study anything related about like what causes the increase of all these groups and the consequence of it, right? And this data set also allows us to measure in which economic activities these groups are involved. And we see a range of illicit activities they are involved, like the most important being illicit drug trade and extortion, but they are also involving in loan sharking, gambling, and a lot of stuff. But increasingly, what we are seeing in Latin America, not only in Rio de Janeiro, is that these groups are increasingly involved in illicit activities, such as local transportation, land and properties. This is light, but it's electricity, gas canisters, and a lot of stuff. So it really is like what we are seeing right now, and we are starting to have in media accounts and some papers trying to discuss and explain. So what is going on is that these groups are diversifying these activities or not, which means that this is not anymore a problem about like illicit drug trade, but a problem, in my opinion, that relies much more about the capacity, the fact that they are really, there is a duopoly of the use of power between these groups and the state. So once you control a territory, like you can explore whatever you want and never have the technology and capacity to do that. And of course, you're going to tax the areas, right? You have the extortion capacity is pretty much taxation and say like, if you want to develop anything in my territory, so you need to pay me in order for me to allow to do that. So, but I also want to emphasize that so far I have talked mainly about criminal groups, but I think one of the problems with criminal groups in Latin America is that made us completely ignore the other part of the crime, which is pretty much ordinary crime and regular crime and urban crime, for instance, being robbed on the streets, which is something that pretty much takes places everywhere and including Latin America. And here I would like to push a little bit on this. So there is this, one of the main criminologists is David Weisberg, and pretty much he claims that based on pretty much on the literature on US and UK, there are like 3 criminology laws, which are the patterns we found in the data that would be the closest to general propositions of universal validity in criminology. One is that a small number of high-rate offenders account for a large proportion of crime. The second one is that there is a age crime curve, which means like crime is typically perpetrated by young people, and a lot of people age out of crime when they are 20s, 20-something, even though nothing happens when there is no punishment against them. And the third thing is that a small percentage of places in a city account for a disproportionately high percentage of crime. We have a lot of trouble to identify whether these patterns repeat in Latin America because especially the first two, it required individual level information. The first one required individual level identified information for us to understand whether you have the same people who are committed most of the crimes. So these two things are actually two things we really don't know about the patterns for low and middle income countries. So I really incentivize students who want to pursue and to create that information. But on the third one, which is like the spatial patterns, actually we have our capacity to create like geocoded crime register has increased over time. And pretty much we can see whether in Latin America we see a pattern that has been documented for rich countries, which is like crime. So David Weisbrod has this coined this law of crime concentration based on like hundreds of papers, which pretty much says that between 2 and 50% of crime, of which, regardless the type of crime you pick, we're going to be concentrated between 2 and 6% of the street segments within the city, regardless the type of a city. Typically, everybody who was introduced to that number the first time say, this is totally impossible that it happens, depending on the level of crime. Of course, you don't have that much level to have like to have 100% of the city being affected by that. But even if you take, for instance, pedestrian robberies, that is something super common. So we did an account for Rio, for instance, that if you completely spread randomly the crime data, we would like 40% of the city would have any type of crime. But when we look at data, we see it's, again, that is much more concentrated. So pretty much there is this small paper made by Spencer Cheney and co-authors that look for several cities in Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico for 3 different types of crime that pretty much says that the patterns of crime concentration repeats in Latin America, or they are even more concentrated. We don't understand much why, but I bet this is probably because our development is much more unequal, which means that we have lower shares of the cities where we see a lot of people like walking around. You have like the urban, the commercial centers are more concentrated. So you have, but much of this is really related to where is the opportunity to commit a crime. And these opportunities are super concentrated, as a lot of stuff is concentrated in Latin America. So I want to move here to discuss what the research has shown about what causes crime and what the consequences of that. So I'm going to rely now, from now on, basically on research, like economic research that is based on causal identification. So there is this paper that I think it's super cool from Diogo Brito, Breno Sampaio, and co-authors that shows is published in Econometrica, and pretty much they are able to map. They take the advantage that in Brazil we can match all the workers in the labor in the formal market in Brazil, and they are all able to match that with criminal prosecution. And they explore the fact what happened with people when you have a mass layoff and people get fired, and what happened with them after they lose the job, whether they engage in criminal activity. And basically they find huge effects. And they show that the probability of criminal prosecution increased by 23% in the first year following the job loss. And this is then stable over a 4-year period. The effect is concentrated by young and low tenure workers, and there are spillovers effects on cohabiting sons, which means that the sons of people who are fired also increase their probability of being engaging in crime. And another thing that is super interesting is that we see these effects not only on property crime, but also in violent crime, which indicates there is also a psychological effect caused by unemployment that also turns the individual more violent. But this paper is super interesting and super important because it shows evidence for for a middle-income country that shows how they argue all over the paper that they really provide evidence that binding liquidity constraints is what is driving crime for many people, which goes completely against with many idea that people have, that you have the type of person who is good and the type of person who is bad, and only bad people get engaged in crime. But really like hard situations can make you get involved with this. And they have very cool other research that goes in that direction. So I think I lost one slide here. We also have amazing work from Mika Ciesbati from Princeton that she shows a completely different setting, but also to the point show that emphasize there are liquidity constraints, that like economic incentives drive the entry in crime. Basically, what she does is that she explore economic shock in Peru, that what happens in Peru after there was an intervention in Colombia that drove coca production to Peru. So there is the increasing demand for coca production, and she shows that there is an increase in the incarceration rate of people who were like when they were 11 years old, 12, 13 years old, the area that they lived was exposed to this shock. You see years later on their increase incarceration rate. With this paper, so this is the paper Making a Narco. It's super nice, super neat evidence about the criminal careers and how people like kids get engaged in this market for coca production. So Mika Ciesbati also has a very nice paper showing that another thing that causes crime is that when you have movement of criminal leaders, they can bring crime to new areas. In particular, she evaluates a natural experiment when you have when U.S. deported a lot of gang members from U.S. prisons to El Salvador. So this was the deportation policy that was launched in 1996, and we see a huge increase in incarceration rate related due to different types of crimes, increasingly after 1996 in the areas there are where these people come from, that people that are being reported, they have connections. When they had the municipalities that received the highest share of people who are reported are the ones that we see a higher increase in crime. So this paper talks a little about what causes this. So we can also have some evidence about what are the consequences of it. So I think the first thing we should talk about the consequences, the violence level, the fact that we have a lot of violence. What are the development consequences about that? Of course, we don't need to talk that the key problem about have a lot of violence are the amount of people that are being killed because of this violence, like because they are involved with crime or even when they don't. But there is also evidence showing that, for instance, this is a paper of mine that show like the turf wars in Rio, the fact that the drug gangs are intermittently involved in conflicts has a direct effect on the provision of public service, especially in schools. We show there is a causal impact on student learning when you have more conflicts, especially in schools very close to the areas that are under dispute, and especially when the conflict is very intense. So we have this phenomena that the schools don't open. Whenever you are on the school, you need to go to the middle of the corridor to protect yourself from the shootings. And this is something that really have harmful effects on schools. But even in the case when you don't have violence itself, it's even more difficult, but even more important to understand the effect of the gang presence per se, because my paper we study especially the incremental effect or when you have a turf war. Mika Servati and co-authors, they also have a very nice paper too. They explore the borders in El Salvador and the gang borders that are designed and mostly following geographical patterns such as roads and rivers. And basically they show that before 96, before this deportation law in the United States, we didn't see any much difference between areas within and outside the gang borders. But 10 years later, using census data, or 20 years later, using a survey data they run, they show that there is huge difference in material well-being, income, education for individuals living within the gang areas compared to individuals living just across the gang areas. And especially the key thing they show, it's a huge difference in labor mobility. And for them, this is one of the key channels. There is the presence of these groups is affecting economic development, that really affecting where people can or cannot work and whether people can circulate and cannot circulate, which in itself is a major thing for urban cities, because one of the key things about cities is to allow people to connect, to interact, to find new opportunities to work. So basically what gangs are doing, like, it's completely like affecting this. So I want to move to the last part of my talk, like to discuss what we can do about that, what we know about this. And first, I would like to start saying what we should have been doing. So by now, the main security policy approach has been crackdowns on the drug trade and military confrontations. We don't have evidence that this has helped at all. Actually, it's a strategy that really increases police violence and create what we call false positives, that a lot of people are killed, claiming that they are criminals, but they aren't. And one of the key problems to the crackdown strategies is that it has been shown by several papers that is not sustained over time and exacerbates the splintering and the fragmentation of gangs. And Mexico is a key case here that is famous for being exposed to this war on drugs. And there is this Melissa Dell's paper, very influential paper, that she explores close elections, and she shows that in municipalities where the mayor was aligned to the federal government, there was an increase in homicides in these municipalities, because these were the municipalities where received more federal support. But what happens that the federal support, like, it decreases the power of the local gang and increase the disputes over the territories there. So it really increased violence, and also there was spillover effects to alternative drug routes. So it was really, like, in terms of policy, it's really, really bad. So, and there are a lot of papers too that shows that, and more than shows, but also argue how the military confrontations has a huge problems of creating violence and creating human rights abuse. One very important point related to the thing that we mentioned earlier about liquidity constraints, both the paper from Brazil and for Peru also shows that, like, liquidity constraint was a major driver of crime. But if you have on the place, in the case of Peru, conditional cash transfers that allow that incentivize kids to stay on schools, these reduced crime. And in the case of Brazil, unemployment benefits was able to reduce crime involvement by workers. And there is other papers that go in the same direction. For instance, there is a Munio and Rossi paper showing that the amount of money, if you give a little bit of money for criminals when they are in the day they are released from prison, there is a huge reduction in recidivism. There is another paper from Chioda, de Mello, and Suarez that shows that conditional cross transfers is associated to lower levels of crime around schools. There is this paper from Chris Blattman showing for Liberia that shows that only cognitive behavior therapy works, but especially works when combined with conditional cash transfers. So there's a huge literature, not only for crime, but also in the conflict area, showing how liquidity constraints is crucial to drive crime and to drive conflict. Another thing that I think does not receive enough attention is what we call place-based approach to reduce crime. This is something that receives a lot of attention in US, but we don't talk much about that in low and middle income countries, because I believe a lot of people think because of the criminal groups, all the crime phenomena is completely different. But again, here we should think specifically about place-based approaches when you think about how we can intervene in the city in order to reduce like ordinary crime, pedestrian crime, and like this very basic type of crime, like robberies in the main city, in the urban core. So the policy, there is more the police approach that receives there is a lot of evidence for US that works, is the hotspot policing, which is basically like you give much more police attention for these small segments that concentrates a higher number of crimes. So there are 3 papers for Latin America that test. The 3 of them are RCTs. They test whether increased police patrolling does reduce crime or not. 2 were made in Colombia, and they do not find major general equilibrium effects. I run with co-authors one in Brazil that show important reductions in robberies. And my explanation for this is that the patrolling levels in Brazil are much lower than in Colombia, but this is something we need much more research to do. There's also research that shows how for US that public illumination matters a lot. Here is a paper that explores the timing of daylight saving time, whether when you have huge variations in homicides when you increase the daylight saving time, and you go back to you increase it again when you end this period. So which really suggests like natural illumination matters to violence. And I'm very behind time, right? So I'm going over here. So I think there's also, I want to finish by thinking about saying 3 things we should think about. Like, so I see the problem of crime in Latin America nowadays as 2 different problems. One is what we should do about regular crime, that we should be following policies that we should try policies that have been done in the United States or in the rich world. And you have another problem. There is this heavily armed criminal groups. That is something that we really don't have much clue about what to do. So we have a big experience in Rio de Janeiro, which is the pacifying police units. It promoted major reductions in crime in the first 5 years, but this was not sustained and created a spillover to other areas. But at least it was the only case I know that it was a crackdown that reduced violence rather than increase. So I think that this experience of the UPP is something that we need to discuss and review in order to think what can be done and what cannot. The fact that we have a lot of police violence, we have a lot of crackdowns. It created a huge problem in Latin America related to, in the Americas as a whole, with police use of force. And we have evidence for Brazil, again, showing that police body-worn cameras was super important to reduce police violence. And we are starting, this is a paper I have about like a type of, I think we should start to test and discuss intermediate levels about police strategies. This is another paper I have on this police strategy that is based by these 3 people on a motorcycle. It created major reductions in crime, in property crime and homicides without increasing police violence. So I think this is this stuff we should be looking at in order to think about new strategies. And the last thing is, like, I would say we have nowadays people that discuss this problem are very concerned with the fact that there is a trade-off between violence reduction and increasing economic power. In some countries, there was, such as Colombia, there was a huge reduction in violence. These groups are still there, but they are not committing the amount of violence they used to commit. But they are still there, and in some cases, they are creating huge criminal enterprises. So there is a crucial trade-off about what is the goal the government should pursue. Of course, you should reduce violence. We cannot live in a country that are shootings and turf wars everywhere. But after that, how can we control the economic power about these groups? And this is one of the questions. So I think these criminal groups are one of the key challenges that we have in security in the 21st century. And I think this is a problem, like, is really harming development in Latin America. And it's something that it may grow in other countries, that I think the way it will grow or not will depend a lot on state capacity and the way the state intervene, which is something that we barely understand. Like, we do not understand at all. And so there is a lot of room here for research. And so, and I'm happy to talk to anyone interested on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Augustin and Joanna. This was very interesting. I particularly like, Joanna, how you ended up with the link to state capacity. Yeah, thank you so much. We're now over to the Q&A part of the lecture. So I'll start off with 2 questions from the chat, but I do ask those of you who are participating live or who would like to participate live to raise your questions now, so we can bring you in with your questions after this. So starting off with a question to Augustin, how do we select tax collectors in low and middle income countries? Do you think that replacing the low performing tax collectors by new ones is either operational or feasible in countries like the DRC, Ethiopia, and others? So that's one for you. One for Joanna, which I thought was super interesting, is what indicator do you think is best to measure the level of security or insecurity in a given city, country? I'm asking this because the literature has observed low correlations between victimization and fear of crime. So the student is particularly interested in the measure. And a little anecdote is that an interesting fact regarding an African country, Madagascar has one of the highest rates of fear of crime in sub-Saharan Africa, but at the same time, it has one of the lowest victimization rates. So over to you.
Should I go first or Joanna?
Yes.
Okay. I think it's a great question. And what's interesting is on the hiring of tax collectors in our setting, at least in Kananga, what we found is there's very few things that predict ability of collector. You might think, oh, it's very complex to identify who are good and bad collectors. It basically boils down to their education level. Higher education level workers do much better. They collect more revenue. They conduct more visits. They exert higher effort. And so if, in some sense, that's reassuring because government can select on few observable variables rather than if I told you it's a very complex, thing to predict. However, the second part of the question is also very interesting. Can you actually do that? Like, yes, you can do it operationally speaking, but are governments willing to actually fire low ability workers and hire better ones? It's very complex because in lots of contexts, the workers are actually not hired because of merit. They're hired because they're connected to a politician or they're actually family members of someone at the tax ministry. And so essentially nepotism is present in those contexts. And that's why we studied not just like the impact of changing workers, but also of reassigning existing workers. There's many contexts where you cannot identify workers, bad workers, fire them, replace them by better ones. you're stuck with your existing workers. And what we find is even in those contexts, by just reassigning workers, you can actually increase tax compliance by 40+% and tax revenue by close to that. So that's hopeful. That means that even in contexts where you can't really hire better collector, you can still do much better by just reshuffling workers. So I think they're excellent points. But we are starting to get good answers on those questions from existing research.
Well, regardless, the question about fear of crime, I think like typically this question, it's based on survey questions about like whether do you feel insecure in your city, in your home, in your neighborhood. So typically it's super high and typically it's low correlated with victimization, is highly correlated with public order, for instance, but like few variables can positive like really explain this variable. I think when we are thinking about how to design public policy, understanding what to do better, I don't think they are good metrics in the sense that they are very subjective. On the other hand, they really matters for political authorities, right? If you have elections, like it's the fear of crime and increasing fear of crime that drives a lot of voting decisions. So I'm super at the same sense. I think in political terms, you should be mapping this. I don't think this is what we should worry. Like we could use this as outcomes in some interventions, but not as the main outcomes and the only outcomes that matter. Specifically, we have been seeing, at least in Latin America, huge increases in fear of crime that we really do not understand what is going on. The objective numbers, objective indicators do not indicate any big deterioration of crime in Latin America in the recent years. So this is another thing that really worth studying to understand what's going on, but it's really impacting voters' preference.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. I don't see any hands raised, so I'll continue to go through some of the questions we had in the chat. One for you, Augustin, on your DRC study on setting tax rate. One student asked whether you were worried about information spillovers. So whether people hearing about other people's tax rates could affect the payment rates of status quo or smaller reduction households. And if so, how was this impact measured or limited? So that's one question. And then for Joanna, there was an interesting one as well on whether you could say something on improving the behavior of street level bureaucrats. So how to place a check on the discretion of policemen, for instance, as they're accused of using violence across both high income as well as low and middle income countries. And the student cites an example of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, which revolved around this issue primarily. So over to you.
Yes.
Right now this, oh, you want on the I'll be brief on like it's an interesting but technical point of whether people knew about their neighbor's tax liability in the context of this randomized control trial and that affected their decision to pay. I think it's a very important point that like a technical reviewer would emphasize. We did a lot to try to measure those type of response because we're also worried about them. And I think what was actually very surprising and interesting to us is when we asked people, we simply asked them, do you know your neighbor's rates? How much was the neighbor's rate, which we can verify? And very few people report knowing the neighbor's rates. It's about like 3% of individuals. And even when we ask them, what's your neighbor's rate, and we compare that to the actual rate, we find that they're often wrong, even when they say that they know their neighbor's rate. So what we take away from that is that it's unlikely to affect our results. And what's interesting, I think, is in lots of countries like the DRC, people tend to be very private about their financial decisions, including, the amount of money they bring at the end of the day to their household, the tax rates that they face, whether they pay the tax or not. It's a context where, people are worried about kinship tax, about social tax. And so their natural solution typically is to be private about those transactions. That's what we see actually in our context as well. So it doesn't seem to be a concern here, but I think it's also an interesting kind of aspect of tax policy to think about in general.
Yes, I didn't say much about state capacity and how can we, And I also saw Juliana here, a very important question about, like, I mentioned a lot about liquidity constraints, but this is not enough to explain crime levels, especially in middle-income countries, and especially we have very poor countries that we do not see this type of crime, this amount of line. So it probably, but there's no hard evidence on that inequality explains much more than poverty. But I have never seen any like good paper that shows something like that. It's extremely hard to measure. But I think state capacity and the capacity of street level bureaucrats, the capacity of law enforcement institutions is crucial. But we don't have a lot to say because there are very limited studies about that. And the reason why there are very limited studies, at least in economics, is there is no data at all about that. And so then another strategy is to run RCTs with partnerships with the institutions in order to understand what they are. But law enforcement institutions are especially closed to do that, much more closed than public health officers like teachers in schools and education department and so on. So we are starting to have, so in Colombia, Santiago Tabon and Chris Blattman and co-authors are doing a lot of experimentation there in order to really work with police, the public security officials in order to try to understand the problem. I have some initiatives in Brazil trying to create partnerships with them too, but it's really like something new. But I also do believe, but again, we do not have, I don't know any particular paper about like, when we think about like the Becker equation, about the probability of committing like that everyone, if you, and the rational behavior, you would balance about the benefits of committing a crime and the probability of being caught. The probability of being caught in Latin America is extremely low for many types of crime. So it's really like the crime pays off in the sense like you need to commit a crime because you are very financial constrained, and like you may face some problems about that, but it's not very clear that you're gonna be responsible for that. And a lot of the public discussion is about like the length, the sentence length, like the size of the penalty once you get caught. But the big problem, and there's literature showing that for the United States, but that I believe that probably applies to middle in poor countries, that what is crucial is the probability of being caught. And this is super, super slow.
Great. Thank you. I think we have time for just one more round of questions. There's one that I think is interesting to you, Augustin, because it connects to Joanna's lecture, which is, lack of law and order may discourage individuals to pay tax. Is there any possibility to connect these two to improve tax collection? So a question on what does the literature say on the link between these two? And then maybe a final one to Joanna is whether the crime increase effect typically come from the same people, thus indicating that crime is their new long-term employment, or whether it comes from different people, thus indicating that crime is rather used to smooth consumption against a shock of being laid off.
That's a great point on kind of crime being part of like not just an outcome of fiscal capacity, but actually a determinant. Like you can think of causality running both ways. Like if people have personal disputes, there is no service provided for those disputes, and they have low trust in the state, low willingness to pay taxes. So this is actually something I'm doing work at the current moment on. We have ongoing randomized control trial with my co-authors on this topic, and we're trying to understand. We're working now not just with the tax ministry, but with the Ministry of Justice, actually, to understand what happens when we help people resolve conflict, and in particular, debt dispute, theft disputes, and property conflicts on their willingness to engage with the state and their willingness to pay taxes. And we want to understand not just formal conflict resolution, not just like going to courts and settling case and having access to lawyers. So that's one component of our intervention, facilitating access to formal justice, but also facilitating access to informal justice. providing you access to the chief and helping them solve disputes. So I don't have an answer to this question as to what the results will find, but this is an active area of research. There's also other work that has been done on conflict resolution, and its importance, focusing more on economic outcomes, not on state capacity. But the hope is to shed light on this question.
So, Juliana, what was my question again?
Yeah, so the question was whether, the crime increase effect typically comes from the same people, or whether it's from different groups, therefore indicating different mechanisms, I guess.
The paper I showed to you is basically like, it shows that when people got laid off, they become criminals. So it's really, my understanding is that these would be like new people. The other thing I mentioned is that typically if you look at the American data, like typically like a large share of crimes is committed by a small group of people, which is means that like what they call like I forgot the name now, but like, so these would suggest that you should like concentrate your effort, the criminal law, for the law enforcement in this tiny group of people. There are people like that commit many types of crime, and this is a discussion we do not see yet a lot, and that I think a lot of what this literature shows is that we need much more targeting than we are having, in the sense that if you have a few number of places with high share of crime, you should put all your attention, most of your attention, to this place. The same thing that if you see a small group of people reoffending all the time, you should put a lot of effort to keep these people arrested. But you also have a great share of people that will commit one crime, two crimes in their life. So there is an issue like how can you, and that what we should do for the first group is completely different than what we should do to the second one.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, I think, to end on. Unfortunately, we're now at time and need to close the discussion, but I wanted to say a huge thank you to both Joanna and Augustin. I think this was very, very interesting, and also to the audience for your questions. These were really great questions. It was very hard to choose. So yeah, thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you next week for the lecture on spatial methods and models. So modeling the city is our thing for next week. But again, Joanna and Augusta, thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.